Hello once again, ladies and gentlemen. This is the second half of our nonfiction unit, focusing on argument. If you remember, we talked about summary and response prior to this, but we really didn't get into the finer points of what it means to actually create an excellent argument. That said, we should first of all talk about what an argument is. So what exactly is an argument? Well, you might think of an argument as something that you do with your boyfriend or girlfriend when trying to figure out what movie you want to watch, or maybe you get in an argument with your parents when they tell you to take out the trash and you had something else that you had to do. But for the purposes of this class, I'd like you to think of an argument as the following. Ladies and gentlemen, an argument is any text or visual that contains a point of view on a subject. Now, I mentioned certainly those arguments that you might have with a significant other or with a parent or a friend or something of that nature. That certainly is more of an informal argument. But you can have formal arguments as well. You will, for instance, be writing an argumentative research paper coming up shortly. That is more of a formal argument, where you're citing your sources, you're pulling information, reasons, facts, statistics, those kinds of things from those sources, and you're using them to kind of defend the position that you've taken. Keep in mind that arguments, though, don't just have to be written or spoken. In fact, arguments can be visual as well. Now, we already talked about some informal spoken examples of argument, and I mentioned the argumentative research paper as a formal written argument. But how are arguments visual? Well, let's talk about that after we give a few more examples of written and arguments. Here are some written and spoken arguments that you might see as you're perusing the internet or as you're in a college course or even when you're going to the doctor. Movie of the Year blares the headline of an online ad for Star Wars Rogue One. Certainly that would be an argument. There's a goal, an objective. They want you to go see the movie, and they're making the argument that you should do so. You might have a college professor who interrupts a lecture and urges students to spend less time texting and more time in the company of thick old books. Certainly he's making an argument, suggesting that you should read more scholarly kinds of literature. And even if you end up going to the doctor, as I mentioned, you might have a nurse who assures you, when you're looking at an approaching needle the size of a piece of PVC pipe that she's about to jam into your arm, she tries to reassure you by saying this won't hurt a bit. Certainly there's a goal, there's an objective there. She wants you to go ahead and get the shot, even though you know that when she says this won't hurt a little bit, or this won't hurt a bit, it's going to hurt an awful lot. So those are some examples of written or spoken arguments, but I mentioned that arguments can be visual as well. This, for instance, would be an example of a visual argument. A stop sign. Think about it. Isn't it making an argument? There's a goal, there's an objective. Obviously, the state that you're in, wherever you're driving, wants you to stop. And it's a pretty effective argument. Because if you think about it, it's stop or get a ticket. Stop or get in an accident. Stop or perhaps even lose a life. It's a pretty effective argument, even though it's a visual. This certainly is an argument. The argument, obviously, is not an argument you see often around here, but it is an effective argument. Go this way 4 miles if you wish to be safe from an oncoming storm. This you probably have never thought of as an argument, but in fact it is. The goal of Wheaties is to get you to eat their cereal, and they even kind of bait you a little bit in the process. You'll be a champion, perhaps, if you eat Wheaties. And for those of you who like political cartoons, even this is an argument. The GPS find gas. The GPS response is dude, buy a bike. Certainly, if you look at the bottom corner where it says gas prices hit new high, there's a commentary being made here, an argument being made on trying to use fuel more efficiently. So these are all different kinds of written, spoken, and visual arguments that exist. Let's talk a little bit, though, about what the construction of an effective argument actually looks like. So the visual that you're seeing in front of you now is what is known as the Aristotelian rhetorical triangle, or Aristotle's rhetorical triangle. You see, Aristotle, who was a Greek philosopher, I think the individual who was responsible for the creation of the Lyceum and parsing out knowledge and so on and so forth into its various categories, this is the guy who's actually responsible at the end of the day for the different subjects that you have in school. One of the areas that Aristotle studied was this idea of argumentation. As a philosopher, certainly he believed in the art of effective argument. Aristotle believed that you had to have three things in order to effectively argue. You needed to establish or have an effective message. Information, reasons, evidence, data, structure, and so on, if you were going to have an effective argument. But if you think about it, if you have a message and you only ever focus on that, your argument is still going to fall flat. Because you need to be an effective communicator when conveying that message. You need to have credibility. You need to have authority. You need to be eloquent, well-spoken, if you will. Your appearance should be, something that makes people stand up and take notice. But if you only focused on those two things, you still could miss the mark, according to Aristotle, because you weren't paying attention to your audience. You see, you need to know who your audience is. I've sometimes given the example that I wouldn't go to a nursing home where there's a bunch of elderly people sitting around in wheelchairs and give them a persuasive speech on why they should not text and drive. Well, why would that be a foolish presentation to give to a bunch of elderly people at an elderly care facility? Well, think about it. My guess is a lot of those people don't drive anymore, and probably fewer of them have a smartphone and engage in texting. The truth is, it wouldn't be a relevant or important argument for them. So Aristotle again believed that you needed to pay attention to the message, the communicator, and the audience if you were going to build an effective argument. Now I'd like to take a few minutes and kind of dissect these three areas a little more. Aristotle, again, as we just mentioned, said that you needed to have a specific assertion that needed to be presented. You needed to have a specific goal, a target, something you're aiming for. And you had to pay attention equally to the logical construction of the argument, the emotional impact of the argument, and the credibility of the speaker. So let's start with the first one of these things. Aristotle believed that there was something that you had to establish known as ethos. Ethos is simply a fancy word for credibility. And you can establish credibility in a number of different ways. Certainly you can establish credibility based on reputation. If you know somebody who has a reputation of being very knowledgeable or being very honest, aren't you more likely to believe them when they tell you something or try to convince you of something? We often look, for instance, at doctors as having a lot of ethos that they're able to establish because they have a lot of education. As soon as you put the doctor prefix in front of somebody's name, automatically it's assumed that they've studied, they've been in school for years, and as a result, they really know what they're talking about. Experience also comes into play. Think about teachers who you might have had throughout the years who were older and have taught for many, many years. Aren't you more likely to believe what they're teaching you because of the experience that they've had, because they've taught for a very long time? Shared values. If you think about it, aren't you more likely to believe somebody who shares your value set? I think this is particularly pertinent when it comes to our political division in this country today. Aren't you more likely to believe somebody, for better or worse, who shares your political values? You're more likely to believe a Republican if you're a Republican. You're more likely to believe a Democrat if you're a Democrat. But aren't you less likely to believe a Democrat if you're a Republican, or a Republican if you're Democrat, because you don't believe that that other side shares all of your values? Now, hopefully, we all have some ethos because we're all Americans, but I think at this point with the division politically in our country, the point is well taken. And then there's this final area. Certainly sincerity is important when establishing credibility. Think about it. If you have somebody who always jokes around all the time, you don't know often when they're being serious or when they're not. But if you have someone who is sincere or serious when they're telling you things, aren't you more likely to believe them? Well, of course you are. So you need to have reputation, education, experience, shared values, and sincerity in order to establish ethos or credibility. But the question might be, what happens if you don't have any of those things? What happens if you are young enough that you haven't been able to establish a reputation? Maybe you haven't gotten all of your education yet because you haven't even graduated from high school. Because you're only 17 or 18 years old, you don't have a lot of experience. You may or may not know what the shared values are of your audience. And certainly, sincerity-wise, teenagers are sometimes not taken very seriously. What do you do then? Well, this is where citing other expert sources comes into play. This is the reason why you need to have a works cited page and effective internal citations, for instance, in a research paper. Because at this stage in your education, none of you are experts, certainly within your particular field. That said, you cite other experts and you use that information to build an argument and thus establish ethos or credibility when arguing. So ethos is fairly important, but Aristotle believed that you also needed to establish pathos. Pathos is certainly very important and kind of connects into a little bit of the audience because you are appealing to the emotion of the audience. Now, how do you establish an emotional connection to your audience? Well, you could certainly address the audience in first person, make it personal, if you will. You could use diction with strong connotations. Certainly there are positive connotative words and negative connotative words that can really get people to focus or pay attention or really revolt people based on the words that you would use and how you would use them. It's appropriate certainly to use very vivid, concrete kinds of description, and without a doubt there's even a place for figurative language when establishing an emotional connection to your audience. Now, if you think about it, when building, say, a formal written argument such as a research paper, where is there a place for pathos? Because we tend to pay a lot of attention to credibility, certainly citing your sources, and the next thing that we'll talk about, logic, or building a logical argument. That said, there still is an appropriate place for pathos in something like a research paper in the introduction and conclusion paragraphs, where you might establish some sort of an attention-getting device. Maybe you'll use an anecdote, or you would use an analogy, something that builds an emotional connection to your audience, sucks them in emotionally, and then allows you to present your logical argument. And certainly your conclusion paragraph can come back to that anecdote, can come back to that establishment of pathos in your introduction in order to kind of reinforce the point. So we've talked about ethos and the establishment of ethos. We've talked about the establishment of pathos. But there's certainly one more piece that we need to talk about, and that is the establishment of logos. If ethos is the establishment of credibility, if pathos is the establishment of the emotional connection, the establishment of logos is where you are appealing to the logic of the audience. This is the place for things like your cause and effect, inductive and deductive reasoning, your assumptions, comparisons, data, evidence, facts, statistics. This is the place where you can build all of these types of arguments, logically speaking. Now, I mentioned a number of different things here, but I did want to mention this idea of inductive and deductive reasoning, certainly, and pay a little bit of attention to that. Inductive reasoning is where you make a generalization, kind of a larger statement, based on specific observations or evidence. An inductive argument establishes or increases the probability of its conclusion. A deductive argument is basically the opposite. If you think about it, it's where you reach a very specific logical conclusion after starting off with a generalization. You deduce this specific conclusion based on your generalization and then some adjoining evidence that allows you to reach that specific logical conclusion. So let's take a look at some examples of inductive and deductive reasoning. The first example, global warming is increasing the temperatures of our oceans. Increased water temperatures destroy coral reefs. Therefore, global warming is destroying the coral reefs of the world, would be an example of deductive reasoning. We start with the larger idea that global warming is destroying the temperature of our oceans, and then we use this other specific idea, increased water temperatures destroy coral reefs, to draw the more specific conclusion that global warming is destroying the coral reefs. That's a difficult one, but if you take a look at the next one, certainly it's a bit easier. Drivers who text and drive spend 10% of their time outside of their lane. Drivers are distracted from driving for a minimum of 5 seconds every time they text and drive. The reality is that texting and driving is unsafe. I've taken some specific pieces of information and I've used it to make a general statement that texting and driving is unsafe based on the data points that I've collected. The third one is a very specific example of a deductive argument known as a syllogism. CJD, which I believe is mad cow disease, is fatal 100% of the time. Joe contracted CJD from eating contaminated beef. Therefore, Joe will unfortunately die from CJD. If you take a look, certainly it appears that this is a very specific deductive argument. I've taken the general statement, I've then drawn a very specific conclusion based on Joe. The next one is another example, for instance, of an inductive argument. Smoking increases your risk of developing cancer, heart disease, and stroke. Smoking is known to cause erectile dysfunction in males. Tobacco use causes an estimated 6 million deaths per year. It is for these reasons that one can see why non-smokers are likely or more likely to enjoy a better quality of life than smokers. Again, I've used specific pieces of information in order to make or come to a general statement or conclusion. And finally, take a look at the one at the bottom. Scientific studies have shown that walking, running, and swimming benefit the heart and lungs. Based on this, aerobic exercises benefit the body. I'm using specific examples like walking, running, and swimming to draw a general conclusion that all aerobic exercises benefit the body. But then if you notice, I go from an inductive to more of a deductive argument. Dancing is also an aerobic exercise. Therefore, dancing benefits the body as well. Here I've used both an inductive argument in the beginning and a deductive argument toward the end to kind of build a fairly complex logical argument. So, we've talked about what it takes to build an effective argument, the establishment of logos, ethos, and pathos, how you have to pay attention certainly to the message, the audience, and the speaker. But what happens if you don't pay attention to these things? What happens, in fact, if you only pay attention to the message? Well, if you pay attention to only the establishment of the message, or logos, you'll end up with something known as abstraction, where you throw so many facts and figures and statistics at your audience that they lose the argument that you're attempting to make. They no longer understand it. But what happens if you don't pay attention to the message? What happens if you only pay attention to the audience? You spend all of your time establishing pathos, or building an emotional connection to the audience. Well, if you have an emotional connection, but you don't have any substance behind it, certainly you end up with something called propaganda, which is where you're able to whip an audience into a frenzy and get them to do what you want them to do without them really knowing why. Hence, again, the propaganda. But what happens if you don't pay attention to the message or the audience? What happens if you only pay attention to the speaker? Well, if all you do is pay attention to the speaker, you end up with something known as egotism. This is where you spend all your time telling people how much education you have, how much experience you have, how sincere you are, how eloquent and well-dressed you are, and so on, to the point that people tune you out because they think you're egotistical or arrogant, if you will. It's for these reasons that you want to create a balanced argument, so that you have established ethos, logos, and pathos to make this argument effectively. So, now that we've talked through all of these ideas, let's take a look at a sample public service announcement and analyze it certainly for its argument. If I'm looking at this particular announcement, certainly the thing that jumps out at me most first is the very attractive woman with a very cute puppy. Obviously, that builds an emotional connection with me, certainly as the viewer of this public service announcement, because honestly, I want a cute puppy like that, and I want to be happy with a cute puppy the way it appears she is. But that's not the only establishment of an emotional connection. If you read the text, you'll notice that it says, saving 5 million begins with just one. Every year, 5 million pets are euthanized in the United States, while countless others are abandoned, neglected, or abused. You have the power to change a life by adopting a pet. If you take a look at that particular writing, there's a few things that emotionally impact me. For instance, I don't like the words abandoned, neglected, or abused. I don't think anybody likes those things. I furthermore don't like the word euthanized. From my perspective, if I can adopt a cute puppy like that to keep the puppy from being abandoned, neglected, abused, or euthanized, I'm more emotionally inclined to do so. So that's the establishment of pathos, but that's not the only form of argument or aspect of the argument that this PSA is employing. If you take a look, certainly, in large print at the top it says saving 5 million begins with just one. This is a logical argument, or the establishment of logos, that is occurring. Because if you take a look, I am envisioning 5 million of those puppies that woman is holding, but I can make it 4,999,999 if I adopt one, or maybe more. And the reality is that if 5 million people adopt pets, then none of them will need to be saved. So it's kind of building a logical argument. You can chip away at that number, certainly a little bit at a time, each one of us, by adopting a pet. And then we get to the final aspect, certainly, of this PSA. If you take a look, how do I know that 5 million begins with just one? How do I know that that puppy needs to be adopted and that perhaps that woman has adopted it? Well, if you take a look at the bottom, it gives us a website. In fact, it invites us to go to the website so that we can learn how to help homeless pets. The website animalleague.org/just1 is inviting us to go there to not only validate the information on this PSA, but find out ways that we can reduce that 5 million number. That's further enhanced by the North Shore Animal League of America. Certainly we have that logo at the bottom, which also suggests that this is a credible PSA that's been put on by an animal shelter, an American animal shelter, that certainly has the goal of saving pets, perhaps specifically puppies, from being euthanized. So if you take a look at this PSA, there is certainly a well-balanced argument that has come into play here. So, in review, in order to have an effective argument, you have to establish a specific position or goal, have a specific message that you're sending. You need to consider the audience, and you need to certainly build a logical argument. You need to establish logos, ethos, and pathos. That said, that brings to a conclusion our Everything is an Argument presentation. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening, and as always, have a wonderful day, and carpe diem.